There is something fascinating about the guitar sound for the Deftones album White Pony. In this video I'm going to break down everything I believe Stef was using at this time, and I'll look at the techniques used by Terry Date in the studio that culminated in this wonderful guitar tone. The last part of the video will show how I tried to recreate some of these tones using the gear I have available to me. With that said, let's get straight into it with Part 1, Stef's gear. Before I talk about the gear used, let me just mention that White Pony is all in drop C tuning, so that would be from the lowest string to the highest, C, G, C, F, A and D. Now, in an effort to be as accurate as possible when talking about Stef's gear, I found an old Guitar One magazine that came out in July 2000, so just a month after White Pony was released. In this interview, Guitar One asks, "Did you use your ESP signature model on every track?" And Stef's response is, "Yeah, I had 4 guitars in the studio, they're all identical, just different colours. I had a green one, a black one, my white one and my sunburst. They've all got 24 frets, a neck-through body design and the same pickups, Seymour Duncan JB pickups in all the bridges." So we can confirm the pickup used was a Seymour Duncan JB and not EMG's. He made the switch to EMG later. In terms of amp, Guitar One asks, "Is the amp rig that you used in the studio the same setup that you used live?" And Stef says, "Same rig. My tone's all Marshall. I've got the JMP1 preamps and the Marshall power amps." Marshall power amp he's referring to here would be the Marshall 9200 power amp. And from looking at videos of his rig rundowns, these are set on voice B. The JMP1 is using the OD2 setting for the most part, as this is the more modern sounding overdrive setting on the preamp. I've seen various people in forums stating that he may have used a Line 6 pod to record some of the tracks from White Pony, but I'm pretty sure this is incorrect. After mentioning what his live rig is, Stef goes on to say, "But I do like the Line 6 amps. Dino of Fear Factory uses the Line 6 stuff." He then goes on to say, "But the tones that Line 6s produce are really good, and since I first started seeing them, I've been telling everybody, man, when Line 6 makes those amps rack mountable, I'm going to definitely throw one in my rig." There is also an interview by Line 6 with Stef on deftonesworld.com, and he says, "I use Line 6 gear in my home studio and in my live rack. At home, my studio is built around 6 main units. A Roland VS1680, the Akai MPC 2000, my Line 6 pod, a power amp, and my speakers." There is no mention here of him using Line 6 in a studio recording with Deftones, so I'm going to assume White Pony was just the Marshall setup. So far there hasn't been any mention of what cabinet he used, and most importantly, what speakers. I believe these would have been Marshall 1960B 4x12s, loaded with Celestion G12T75 speakers. This seems to be confirmed by a video I found from John at Sonic Drive Studios that says this.
"And up until the Diamond Eyes record, he used the same cabinets, which is the Marshall 4x12 cabinets loaded with Celestion T75 speakers."
He also mentions that Stef had the bass shift setting engaged on the JMP1. As this came from Stefan himself, I'm inclined to take this as correct. I've seen people mention he used greenbacks to record White Pony, but in my testing, these did not have the frequency response needed for this tone. Lastly, let's look at what he says about his effects rig. Guitar One asks, "What does your effects rig consist of these days?" And Stef replies, "I have 2 rigs and they're damn near identical, with the exception of the Rocktron gear. I have an IntelliFX online in one rig and a RepelFX in the other, but everything else is identical. In one I have a TC Electronic Fireworks unit and I have their GeForce in the other one. I have a TC 2290 in each rack, but I use it at its bare minimum state. I have yet to even tap into what's available in that thing." I'll admit, I have no idea what Stef does with all of these effects units. In my tone hunt, I have only focused on the songs that Stef plays on without any of Chino's guitar parts, and the only songs I feel he uses effects are some chorus and maybe reverb on Knife Party, and what sounds like some reverb on Passenger. Anyone out there that knows what else he may have used, please drop a comment, but to me, Stef seems like he loves an effects unit just to have it. There is also a Guitar.com article about White Pony that states Stef's Boss FZ2 Super Fuzz was used on the album, but I have no idea where that comes from. I have a Behringer SF300 Super Fuzz that is a clone of the Boss, and it doesn't get anywhere near these tones. There is plenty of gain in the JMP1, and in the Guitar One interview, Stef doesn't mention any stomp boxes either, just rack effects. Now that covers Stef's gear, now let's move on to Part 2. White Pony's production. This album was of course produced by the wonderful Terry Date, and once again I wanted to try and get as much accurate information as possible. I managed to find an old EQ magazine from August 2000, so again, this came out not long after White Pony was released. In terms of what microphone was used on Stef's guitars, Terry says, "I almost always throw a 57 in front of the guitar cabinet, and that's all I use. People always say they like the guitar sounds on records I've produced. I wish I had something fancier I could tell them as far as what I do. I've tried expensive mics, multiple mics, but the most I ever use is 2 on 1 cabinet. I think it's more about the sound that's coming out of the cabinet than the mic that's in front of it. And for louder, heavier, distorted sounds, I need a mic that can really take a lot, so a 57 seems to be fine for that." He also gives us some great insight onto how he likes to EQ low, heavy guitars. He says, "On an SSL, I'll typically run a low-end filter on those heavy guitars as much as I dare to. I'll filter up to maybe 120 Hertz even, and then I'll go back down to about 50 Hertz and add some in. It adds a weird phase nightmare, I guess, but sometimes I can get away with that. It tightens up the sound, and if it's a straight, chunky rhythm guitar part, I'll tend to suck out straight up the middle, somewhere in the 1.2 kHz region. Then I'll try to add a little bit in, up around 2 or 3K, all on narrow bandwidths, again on an SSL. One thing I found really interesting in the interview was this question: can you layer guitars, double and triple track the same part when you're tuned that low? And Terry's response to this is, yeah, with heavy ones I always do at least 2. I used to do 3 all at the same time, but I found that if you do your job right, 3 is kind of unnecessary, unless you want to have more of an upper mid-range sound, or if you want to fill out the hole that you sucked out of the 2 other ones. If you've got those panned wide, sometimes it's good to pan a third track up the middle that's a little bit more standard sounding. Sometimes I'll even do 4. 2 identical, one with one type of guitar panned left and right, then 2 identical ones with a different sounding guitar, just to thicken the sound out a little bit. This one paragraph sent me down a complete rabbit hole of trying 3 different guitar parts. 2 out wide and 1 down the middle. I can't make up my mind on this. I think most of the album is 2 guitar tracks panned left and right, but some songs have a massive guitar sound to them, so they may have been quad-tracked, or they may have had another track just straight up the middle, so 3-tracked. It's hard to tell, and I'm by no means a qualified engineer, so that is my best guess. For my examples later in the video, I just stuck to 2 tracks panned left and right. Terry also mentions that he only compresses clean guitars, so this may have been a part of the tone for the intro of Knife Party. I think that covers the important parts of the production side, so let's move on to part 3. My attempt at the tone. The hurdles facing this tone are pretty high and plentiful, as I have found over the last few months while I bash my head against the wall trying to get this tone. The first being my guitar. I don't have an ESP Horizon with a JB, but I use my Ibanez RG that has 24 frets and a Damasio tone zone that is a fairly comparable pickup to the JB, but obviously not identical. My Ibanez also has a floating bridge compared to Stef's through neck and strings through the body design. How much of a difference this makes on the overall sound, I can't say, as I'd need one of his signature models to compare against my guitar. In terms of amp, I don't have a JMP1 and a 9200 power amp lying around, so I'm using the JMP Pro by Nembrini Audio that has a modelled EL34 power amp with it too. Now this is the next headache. Because the JMP1 allows presets, it takes a while to figure out what the EQ and the amp should be set to for each song, as they are all different. To try and get some inspiration, I found the owner's manual for the JMP1 and noticed that in the default presets, the volume on the unit is always pushed quite high. The plugin has the volume set at 13 as the default, which is fairly quiet. So for most of my attempts at songs, the volume was set on at least 18 or sometimes 20. I assume that Stef is a guy that likes to play loud. But the absolute biggest obstacle I found was finding the best IR of a Marshall 1960B with G12T75 speakers. Here are 4 different examples without any post EQ work of T75 IRs that I purchased trying to find the best one. Take a listen. You can hear how different these all sound from one another. It is virtually impossible to get a good bass sound with just these IRs, and the most frustrating thing is not having the physical amp and cab to simply be able to take the mic and move it slightly to try and get a closer match, or even put it on a completely different speaker With a 4x12, we obviously have 4 to choose from. So after a ton of testing, I went with the Modern Classics pack from Redwires. This is using a Marshall 1960B with G12 T75s. It seemed to have the best lows and highs compared to the others, but it did mean I had to do a ton of extra EQ work to get my guitar to even sound remotely close to Stef's. To try to be as accurate as possible, I split the tracks I wanted to use up in a program called Moises to remove the guitar, bass, drums, etc. from one another. I then added a tone match software to create a visual representation of Stef's guitar. This reference I then added to my guitar group to see what EQ I needed to add. I didn't want to just hit the match EQ function, I wanted to see how close I could get with the information I had uncovered. I double tracked my guitar parts and then went about EQing the guitars the same way Terry mentions in his interview. I used an SSL channel strip plugin by Waves for this. I then added a digital EQ on each guitar track and the overall guitar group to further shape the tone. I found cutting the mid-range frequencies a lot easier with the digital EQ rather than the SSL strip, as I could be more accurate. It was then a case of using the reference that I had from the tone match software to change the JMP's EQ, the SSL, or the digital EQ. This is how the Fai Cesera intro and first verse turned out. It's somewhat close, but definitely not the same. I can hear some big differences in the mid-range, especially in the upper mids. I have spent such a long time EQing these different songs and then comparing my guitar to the studio version back to back to be fairly close, but still so frustratingly far away. In the end, I found a post on Reddit of someone who had managed to convert Stef's fractal IR files to a standard WAV file, and in my frustration, I added the White Pony one, and straight away the IR pretty much lined up with my reference. By using the same techniques Terry used, the sound can be shaped even further, and without the crazy amount of extra EQing I had to do. I can't seem to find the Reddit post anymore, so I have added a free download link to this IR in the description of the video. Here's my heavily edited version of Fai Cesera against the White Pony IR and the studio version. While still not exactly the same, I feel the White Pony IR does a better job of getting closer to the overall tone. Interestingly, I found I couldn't have the bass shift engaged when using the T75 IR, as the sound was just way too bass heavy, but I could use it when using the White Pony IR. The next examples all use the White Pony IR, and I will flick between my version and the original track. I tried my absolute best with getting a good comparison to Knife Party, but I just couldn't get anywhere near the tone on that song. I wonder if the intro's tone is very reliant on the chorus from the Rocktron unit maybe. I don't have anything that can get close to that tone, and when the distorted guitars come in, I really have no idea there. They are so loud and have this really thick low mid to them that I just can't replicate. I tried quad tracking this part, but it still didn't sound anywhere close to the studio version. If anyone has any info for how they recorded this track, please leave a comment, that would be amazing to find out. Anyway, I hope you enjoy these examples.
Police stop chasing
So in conclusion, and kind of as expected, my version doesn't really hit the same as the studio versions. They get close at some points, but I can hear some clear differences in the lower and upper mids. Obviously, there is so much that goes into this guitar tone, from how Stef plays his guitars, to the gear he uses, to the techniques used by Terry in the studio. But it has been fun, if not a little frustrating to try. If you'd like to have a go with the White Pony IR yourself, I've included a link in the description where you can download that for free. Thank you so much if you made it this far through the video, and I'll see you in the next one.